So we're going to talk now about building a great user experience for content editors. And you guys just met me, Suzanne, so I'm not going to introduce myself too much. Got some slides here. So I'm really have been thinking a lot recently about the content editor experience. And I think it's an important thing to focus on because as site builders, we use the admin UI for Drupal all the time. And so we're kind of these mega experts in what the content editor experience is, like in using it ourselves. So we just think it's easy because we're like, oh yeah, of course, all the nodes are here and all the taxonomy terms are here. And that's why I think people have a hard time actually addressing the user experience challenges of content editors, is because to us it just seems all intuitive. Another reason that it's hard is because information architecture in Drupal is often complicated. Like, we use Drupal, we don't use WordPress, we use Drupal because we need a more complex information architecture. So then, because we have like different relationships in the content, the thing that we're getting content editors to do to edit this complex content is actually a big challenge. And so you end up with these charts, like when you're planning the project for like, oh yeah, these are going to be nodes and these are the taxonomy terms and here's all these paragraphs and entity relationships. And then when you actually just put it in the user experience, it's just these massive forms that are challenging to figure out. So that's why the content editor UX is often not ideal. At the same time, I think in Drupal 8, we have tons of tools built just into Drupal to make the user experience better for content editors. There's like lots of things we can just do with Drupal out of the box. So we have a way better field configuration. We have form display settings, which make the form for editing content really configurable. We can set up views, admin views, well, they're already set up for us, so we can just edit them to make views that are meant for content editors. And then just like always in Drupal, flexible permissions. We have WYSIWYG built in, new things like the layout builder. So there's just all these tools that we can use as administrators or site builders to make the editing interface make more sense. And then if you go beyond that and you really need something customized, like if you're a Drupal developer, you can also go in and write hooks to change forms, and you can go and customize the admin theme and make widgets and field types if you need to even make that interface more closely connected to your content and easier to use. So when I was at DrupalCon this year, I went and saw there was a presentation on the material admin theme. So there's this new admin theme that people are talking about that's cool because it makes your Drupal site kind of look like Google. And so you might think like, oh yeah, we can just install this nice theme and then it will be easier for people to use because it's pretty, which is not exactly how user experience works, right? So I want to differentiate a bit between just having a nicer theme, which can actually make people happy and encourage them to be happy content editors. But beyond this, there's a lot that you need to do more just in terms of user experience, like the way things are labeled, the way people have to click through to edit things. That's going to make an even bigger difference, I think, for content editors to make it easier for them to do their job. So what I'm going to talk to you about today, it's not like a solution, it's not like a do this one thing, one weird trick, and your Drupal site's going to be easy to use.
Nobody's going to click on this presentation.
Yeah, I know. That's like number one complaint. Suzanne, you didn't tell me what to do. This is like, I'm not going to actually tell you what to do. I'm just going to tell you to do UX a lot. So when do you do UX in a project? All the time. And especially for content editor UX, I think it's something that we don't really think about until actually you're showing it to maybe your client or showing it to the person who's going to have to edit the content. So usually it's something you do very much at the end. And it's going to be easier to do it if you think about it even just a little bit closer to the beginning. So if you start thinking about how people are going to edit pages and things on your site from the get-go, even just asking a few questions and getting the structure of your site more in line with content editor expectations, it's going to help. So at the beginning of your project, you can do things like figure out what users actually need to do on the site, get content editors in the room just to figure out like what do they call things, like what's the terminology that they use. Because if the people working in the site call something a strat and you're calling it a banner, then they're going to be confused when you use those labels in the information architect or in the structure of the content. Then during your configuration and development, I mean, building out user stories might seem like overkill for content editors, but I think it can be useful if you have a few key things that editors are going to be doing all the time to figure out just what is the content they're going to be editing most often, and what's that workflow look like? Like, what do they edit first or second if there's kind of an ordering to it? And then testing out the experience of content editors. You might not think about this because in testing there's so much to test on the front end of the site. You might not think to test the admin UI, but testing could just be like when you're training somebody. You're training somebody to use the website and you actually watch them and use that opportunity to make improvements. And that's something that, I mean, typically you'll do at the very end of the project because you're training somebody. But if you can get them involved a little sooner, if you have the content editor around and you can say, hey, try editing the content now. It's kind of something that we hesitate to do because when the site's not finished, you don't always want to show somebody the back end of it, but it can help you understand better how someone else is going to be thinking through it, and even just watching them is going to help you figure out the problems. So when I think about the strategy and definition part of this, you are going to be thinking about, okay, what do editors actually want to do? And believe it or not, some editors just want this. What is this? This is like just a blank WYSIWYG editor where they have one body field to enter everything. Yes?
Does it happen that when you have a project that you go through different editing strategies? Like for instance, let's say you're building a website and you have a lot of content to put in. You have a lot of content needs to be sorted and all sorts of things. The taxonomy needs to be defined, and eventually you'll come to more update where you won't do as much, shuffle around. So to change the way, like content will be taken in the system.
You mean, okay, the question is about the content structure and how it could start off being complicated, but then you need to simplify it, is that right?
Well, because sometimes in the beginning, for instance, you want to do bulk, you have lots, so having to say add, it's long.
Oh, I see.
To have something,
Yeah. So, okay, so great point. So sometimes there's a difference between the experience you want when you're populating the site initially and the experience you want when people are actually managing a live site. I think that's really a very insightful, like especially things like a content editing workflow. If you have to have content in the production environment that passes through a draft and then approved and then published, if you're just getting people to enter content in the site, that's going to be really painful for them. So just giving everybody the ability to publish content initially is going to make it easier. And then in terms of adding complex taxonomy terms and things, I think sometimes if there's really a lot of content, what we do often is a migration to get all that content in, because it's just going to be easier than having somebody go through and enter that all manually. Depends on the project. But yeah, that's a good thing to think through too. So sometimes when we're talking to content editors, even when we're demoing something where we've structured the content in some way, a lot of them will end up asking for something that actually looks like this. It's like, okay, even though you added this field for adding an image or this field for adding some media, I still just want to have a big text area where I can enter in everything and have WYSIWYG to build the HTML that I want. That happens sometimes, and then sometimes content editors get really excited about tools like this, like the layout builder. So if you look at the layout builder in Drupal, it's sort of like almost, well, some people call it like panels in core, so it's a way of attaching a layout and a layout to either a template for content, like a template for a content type, or for an individual piece of content, kind of like what Panelizer would do, and allow you to populate that layout with content. So sometimes content editors say that that's what they want. They want this flexibility to move things around and add layouts on the page. And so it's often a good idea to ask more precise questions, not just what do you want, but things like what are the common use cases, what needs to be easy to edit, like does the order of things need to be editable, how can we make something simpler, like if there's like a really complex workflow but it only applies to one piece of content, like it's only for the home page, maybe you can simplify things a bit. And then what do content editors call things, like I was saying before. And while you're doing this, you want to keep in mind like what the goals of content editors are. So it goes beyond just editing content, the basics. You also have content editors who often need to be able to edit things like blocks or taxonomy terms. They want to know what the content's going to look like before they publish it, so that's sometimes a challenging thing, like getting a good preview. Making content that's accessible, that's a challenge for a lot of editors who are maybe have some idea about accessibility, but they're not experts, so they need help. Getting content scheduled and published, that's something that sometimes gets overlooked until the end of a project. People assume that there's going to be a content moderation workflow, then translating content is important. And then sometimes you have more marketing savvy content editors who also want to be able to do marketing kind of tasks through content editing. So they actually want to be able to go and build landing pages, not just simple content. So these are all important things to figure out when you're at the start of your project. And so you can go through and kind of figure out what are all these goals that they want, and then how do you translate this into actually what we can build in Drupal. So when we're talking about building a site, here are some examples of things that we can do. So here are the solutions, but they're like tiny little things that you do. So for adding and editing content, I think a huge thing you can do is just uncluttering the admin UI. So often when I'm looking at a project that somebody's built in Drupal, you'll see these edit pages that have all these things in it that people don't actually need to edit, like some legacy ID or the promoted to front page little checkbox, which doesn't do anything. And this is super confusing for people. So just by removing things, you can gain a lot. Picking field names and content type names that make sense. I think field names people think more about. Sometimes content type names are really vague. Like even before we had the concept of entities in Drupal, we had websites where there was a content type called entity, or you have a content type called like I don't know, service or context or some word that doesn't mean anything. So make sure that your content type names are meaningful, and if they don't mean something to you automatically, maybe write a description.
If you build a content type and you start populating it a little bit, then you realize that the name you picked for that was bad. Is that something you can change?
You can always change the label. Yeah, so sometimes with these naming things, like you can't change the machine name for something, but you can still change the label, which maybe is going to make it confusing for developers. But if it makes it easier for the content editors, maybe it's worth it. Better that they're the same, so better if you figure it out at the beginning, but the labels you can always change. Another thing that's just really basic, having links for adding content that are clear, like having a nice interface that's just letting people create the content, and then having a content overview page. So the standard content overview page in Drupal is just a view. So you can sometimes gain a lot just by adding a filter to that view or adding an extra column. Depending on the content, that might be really useful for people. Or if there's one content type that's like got 20,000 nodes on your site and it has some extra taxonomy terms that people might use to find it, maybe build people an extra content overview page just for that. So these are things that you can do probably in half an hour, and this is probably the biggest impact. So even if you just have that much time, just do this, and you're already going to be better than, I would say, most Drupal sites for content editor experience. For the content, another thing that's huge for the content editing experience on the managed form display is picking field types, and that's something that often we don't take the time to do. So if you're building out a content type, usually you'll focus on the actual content and what it looks like to the end user. But it's a good idea to just take a minute to think about what the field widget is going to be like for the content editor. So one example that I look at is taxonomy term reference fields. So by default in Drupal 8, the taxonomy term reference field uses an autocomplete, which is not very user-friendly unless people really know the content well. So if I just come to a page and I'm trying to fill in this cuisines field, and I just have an autocomplete, I have no idea what the types of cuisines are on the site. Like if I'm new to content editing on this site, I'm not going to know what to fill in. I don't have any examples that I see because it's autocomplete. So if it's a short list, you can make something into a select box or radio buttons, and it's probably going to be easier. But then you run into the issue if you have hundreds of items or even 50 items, it's going to be a big select or a big list of checkboxes or radio buttons. So in this case, if it's important for the thing to be usable, you might look at using a field like chosen. So it's a contrib module you can use to just turn the field into a combo box so you get both the drop-down and the autocomplete at the same time. So that's just one example. And again, like using an extra module for something like this, maybe that's not worth it for your site if you have really savvy content editors and they know what the taxonomy terms are. But if it's a thing where you want to have a lot of contributors and you want to make the experience better, it might be something to consider. Editing content, we also want to focus in on media. So media is one of those places where Drupal's always been like, well, you can figure that out in contrib. Like the built-in tools are, not as good as maybe what people are used to if they're using WordPress, right? So what contrib looks like now is something like this. There's the entity browser module, which works with the file browser, and that gives you a UI for selecting files that have already been uploaded to the site. So especially for things like images, where people might want to reuse images, this is basically going to provide them with a library of images that have been used on the site that they can search through. And this takes a bit more time to implement, so this isn't in the category of something that's going to take like 1 hour just to make the site a bit easier. So this is something that you have to spend a bit of time configuring, making sure you get the right results, because it is quite flexible. It's a view, so you want to make sure you have the right things showing up in here. Hiding the craft I already mentioned. You want to disable stuff that you're not using. And help text is important. So sometimes when you start talking about usability, people just go and say, oh, we'll just add lots of help text, and then it will all be clear. But you'd be surprised how many people would never read the help text. So the shorter the help text, actually, the better. So you have to think through this balance. But if you have something like a video field, like if you've ever used the video embed field and you don't configure it and you just add it to something, there's nothing to indicate that you're supposed to stick in a video URL in the field. So you really have to tell somebody. So really look at the form and think, okay, if I didn't build this, would I know what to do? And if the answer is no, then you have to put something to help. For images, there are settings in images for a minimum and maximum size. You might think that that's just annoying for content editors because it means that they can't just upload any image, they have to pick and choose, but it's actually hugely helpful. So if somebody doesn't know how the image is actually going to get used on the page and you just put it in the configuration, this is the minimum size, that's really going to help them. It's going to put the help text there for them and then prevent them from creating content that doesn't make sense. And that's a huge thing for content editors. If somebody's creating content and then what they see on the page is not what they expected, they get a big surprise, that's not a good experience. So like if you have a field, for example, that's not required, and then you hit save, and then there's a big hole in the page where the field was supposed to be, that's a bad experience. So even though making fields required annoys content editors, it's actually going to make the overall experience better, unless your design can adapt. So there are, if you look like in the forums, yeah, there have been some ideas put forth, like in the Admin UI initiative, for other user interfaces that have a better way than Drupal of making it so you're not surprised when you hit save. This is one thing that's been thrown out there. So it's an interface where you see the preview at the same time as you're editing the content. But this is really hard to do with Drupal because we use content in so many different ways on a Drupal site. So if you have content that's being used in 5 different views, someone can't really preview what that's going to look like. You also have issues with responsiveness because the preview is probably only going to show you one screen size. And so it's not always going to be evident. So this is kind of a more nuanced one, I think. This has like, this is what the content's going to look in different contexts. And that's cool, but like that's also harder to build, so probably further down the line for what Drupal would look like. So in the meantime, what we can do is we can provide just good required fields, provide defaults if we need to order the fields maybe in the same way that they're ordered on the front end. That kind of helps with predictability. And then also just enabling previews if that's something that is going to help your content editors. So previews in Drupal 8, if you haven't looked at them yet, previews in Drupal 8 way better than previews in Drupal 7. So don't be afraid to enable previews for users. It might really help them out a lot. So beyond those fields, we also often do have to put in something like a WYSIWYG editor for content editors if there's some kind of content that needs some more flexibility. And so what are some good practices for a WYSIWYG editor experience? So one thing is just to plan out the buttons and the formats that you provide in the WYSIWYG editor to match the content. So rather than asking necessarily your content editors, what buttons would you like? I would suggest not doing that. I would suggest looking at the content that they have and seeing what kind of HTML that they use. Maybe if you're doing a content audit as well, think about, okay, what things can be removed? Like maybe we don't need to underline and use tables quite so much, so do we need all these buttons? So you want to be thinking about what the content is that they're actually trying to produce. Another thing to really think about for content editing are the text formats. So text formats, by default, you just get to put them in an order, and that order is going to be the order that they're used in the drop-down below the long text fields, right? So whatever is the default text format, that's what most people are going to use to create content. Like probably 90% of the content is going to use that. So full HTML is the default. You want to make sure that people actually have permission to use full HTML. Otherwise, what do you see? You see this like big gray box that says, you can't edit this content. So that's a really bad user experience. Another thing you can do, so if you have like some content where you really want to allow a lot of any HTML and then other content where you do want to restrict it, you can use the allowed formats module, and that's going to allow you to change what formats are available for each content type. So rather than just having people use the default every time, you say, okay, this simpler content can just have restricted HTML, whereas this more advanced content or more rich content has to allow any HTML. So that's also going to improve the experience because the content author doesn't have to think about the formats. They'll just have a default that makes sense. And then remember with the WYSIWYG editor, there is a WYSIWYG editor, like a set of buttons that comes out of the box with Drupal. That's not necessarily what you need to use, right? Just because it comes out of the box, it doesn't mean your job is done. So make sure you go into the settings for that and think about what buttons make sense. And then if you need to, there are also modules that extend the WYSIWYG editor. So the WYSIWYG editor out of the box in Drupal doesn't provide all the possible functionality that a WYSIWYG editor could have. So you might want to make it easier for people to add links between their content. There's a link it module for that that's pretty useful. I find content editors love this module. Makes a huge difference for them. Editor file allows people to put files more easily into their WYSIWYG content. And then if you really want, or if people really want to have more structured content within the WYSIWYG editor, I try and always avoid that, but if it's needed, there's a WYSIWYG template module. So you can actually have a template for some HTML that you want people to easily be able to stick into the editor. So at least if somebody's trying to do fancy stuff in the editor, at least they're using some consistent markup that you've predefined. And then finally, we all know that what you see is what you get is a lie. Completely. You go and you format something and then you publish it and it's like, oh, that was capitalized instead of title case, or this is a completely different color, or this gets left aligned, or the image gets shrunk down. So having a real WYSIWYG experience where you see what you get, you can make this more real for people by adding some CSS in your theme that's going to be used in that CK editor. So this is actually CSS that you put into your own theme that's going to be used on the front end, and then that is going to get carried over to the WYSIWYG. And you can look for an example of this in Bartik. The Bartik theme does that. Publishing and translating content. So it's great to have a nice interface for just the editing screen, but content is actually living like in a workflow, in a content publishing workflow. Even if the workflow is just you publish content and then it's published. Sometimes we need to make the workflow a little bit more nuanced than that. So now we have content moderation in core in Drupal 8, which is awesome. So we have a real way to have drafts of content and to create additional states. So if content needs to be reviewed before it gets published, you can set that up. And you can enforce all of this with permissions. So you can say, these types of users are allowed to publish content. These types of users can only create drafts or mark things as needs review. So you can really have more flexibility in terms of who can publish what. And I think here the biggest gain for content moderation is just the ability to have drafts. Even that, even for a website that doesn't seem to have a publishing workflow, the fact that you can make a version of content that's the most recent version that's not published is huge. It's really, really powerful thing to add to the experience for content editors. And just one thing that I would suggest if you're creating a content moderation workflow is just to keep it simple. So often people get excited about content editing workflow and they're like, oh yeah, we're going to have this whole process and people are going to review the content and then they're going to approve it, and then you just had this meeting, right? There's a big meeting and everyone's like, yeah, this is how it's going to work. And then you launch the site and then everybody gets to be an administrator and publish everything. So, try and curb the enthusiasm and just say, okay, let's just start with this simple version, and then we'll see what you need in a month after you launch. This is what you try and say. All right, so editing complex pages. So, really great to use Drupal. We have content types, we have fields, predictable content, all sounds great. But then what people really want are these like landing page things, right? They want to be able to build out this beautiful visual content that combines images, and they've seen something like, what is it, Wix, where they can just drag and drop stuff, and they're like, what, doesn't Drupal do that? That's what I want. They just don't understand. Structured content is awesome. And so this is one of the hard problems in Drupal content, the Drupal content management, right? How do you even construct these landing pages in the first place? And then when you give them to content editors, can the content editor even figure it out? And so one thing that I know really frustrates a lot of content editors, even me, like if I'm looking at someone else's Drupal site and I didn't have anything to do with building it, and I look at the homepage and I'm like, I want to edit that bit of text in the middle of the homepage. And what do? I usually use the inspector tool to figure out, okay, what is it? Is it a block? Is it a paragraph? Is it a field? What is this thing? And then I can figure out how to edit it, but how would a content editor ever know, right? So this is a huge challenge. So using blocks and paragraphs to store chunks of content is often what we end up doing for complex landing pages. And so we have to make sure that it's actually easy for people to figure out what component they're editing. So where's the edit link? This is the big question. So what we try and do these days is usually have a one edit link per page on these pages and just reference everything from that content. So if you have a landing page and you click edit, you want to be able to edit all the components, whether they're blocks or paragraphs, just within that page. And so we can have the whole blocks, paragraphs debate. Basically, but I'm not gonna do it. So, so having paragraphs. Okay, so for those of you who are like, what do you mean blocks, paragraphs debate? What are they all talking about? So blocks and paragraphs are types of content in Drupal which you can use to build out little pieces of content. So we usually use nodes for like a whole page of content, but if you just want to make it so that this part of the page is separate, maybe it's a set of 3 or 4 fields, and then there's another one and another one, we can use blocks or paragraphs to create these reusable chunks. So the module that we used to use for things like this was called field collection, which I think was a good term. So like a collection of fields that's editable and then maybe repeatable, so you can create a whole bunch of them on a page. So if you had to create, like here, a whole bunch of calls to action or a whole bunch of like fancy paragraphs with different colors, and you want to make them flexible so that the content editor can just pick how many they want and if they can be reordered. This is what I would use paragraphs or blocks to build out. So you use a paragraph or block for each chunk, and then you reference those from the page content type. So using paragraphs, if you're going to go that route, you want to make sure that you actually look at the settings for the paragraphs so that you have a nice looking form in the end. Because if you have a lot of nested content like this with the ability to insert paragraphs into a page, you might end up with like 10 forms in your form, and then it can take really long to load, and your form's going to be massive. Like they're going to have to scroll down for 10 minutes to find that little piece of content to edit. So there's settings in Drupal and the manage form display you can use to customize that to make that edit experience a little better. So you click edit and you see kind of a preview of what your page looks like, and then you can edit each component within it. So that's something you can do with paragraphs. With blocks, it works in a similar way, and you'll want to use the inline entity form module if you're doing that with blocks. And the reason to use blocks would be if you wanted the content to be reusable. So let's say you had a page that has this nice paragraph like our mission, etc. You wanted to put that block on that content on a bunch of pages, then you could use a block to do it. If you just need that content to be on that one page, you could use a paragraph to do it.
With the blocks?
Yeah.
Do you get the options for preview? Like for instance here we have the image. Can we have an image also when we have the inline entity form?
That's a good question. I don't think it's as flexible as the paragraphs. I don't think you're going to get that same nice preview. So that could be another reason maybe to use paragraphs. Trying to think. Maybe you could customize that, but I don't think we've ever done that. So I'm not sure how easy that would be. Yeah, it's true. The thing on the left looks more friendly. This is why everyone likes paragraphs. They're like, yeah, paragraphs.
Well, if you put the images.
Yeah, if you have nice content, if you customize it. So this one is controversial. I didn't think it was controversial till I started talking to people about it at DrupalCon. So sometimes on a complex landing page or just in general, you'll, like at the top of a view or something, you'll have some text that is marketing text. So like this kind of text, find the opportunity that's right for you. This is very marketing-ish, right? So some person who's a content editor who also is like a marketing person might come and say, oh, I want to update that to make it sound more like our brand or like to have a different tone, right? Especially if they weren't thinking too hard when they initially wrote it, when you were launching the site. And so sometimes we have the tendency when we're building a site to put text like that into the configuration, like into the title of a view or into the configuration title of a block. And so if it's part of configuration, it means that normally when you build a site, you want that to be part of your configuration management workflow. And so when you put something into configuration as opposed to content, it's almost like you're writing code. And so if you have some marketing text, it's better not to put it in configuration, not to put it into what's going to end up in code. So if you're editing a view and you find yourself putting all this marketing text into the view's configuration UI, you got to think, okay, a content editor is never going to edit this view. Like you would not want them to, right? They wouldn't know how to do that. That's not their job. And so you shouldn't put that text into that configuration. Better to put that text as, store it as a block, which is content, or use some other kind of content entity type to manage it so that it's not hard-coded in the configuration. Now, I say that, but then talking to people at DrupalCon, sometimes people are like, oh, well, how long are you going to spend just for one piece of text? They could just get some configuration person to edit it, and that's going to make it way easier for you to build it. And anyway, they're probably not going to ever change this bit of text. So there is a balance between the upfront time that you're going to spend making something really easy for content editors versus how often are the content editors going to actually use that.
It's always more often than you think.
Yeah, so it really depends. So you have to kind of know your use case, and it's also going to depend on who's going to be updating the configuration in the maintenance of the site. So last note about complex pages. We have a new kid on the block, a new tool to use for building these things, the layout builder. How many of you have tried the layout builder? Yeah, it's this kind of cool thing, like in core. It's experimental, very experimental. I'm going to say it again. It's an experimental module. So you should not use this yet, but you should use it. I mean, you should try it, and you should talk about it and think about how you're going to use it. And if you have ideas about the user experience, there's actually issues you can work on, just even writing CSS to improve this interface. So if you are one of these people who wants to contribute and knows some CSS, I know that there's one issue that was tweeted about just 2 days ago that needs work to improve the UI here. So there's, but just to explain a bit what the layout builder is. So the layout builder is this UI for basically creating a template for your content, for things like content types. So think about if you've ever used the display suite module and you have, instead of just your manage display tab for your content type, you have a manage display tab with regions that you can drag and drop content into. It's kind of like that. So it's kind of like you have a template builder, but it's visual. It's not just something that you have to open up a Twig template to do. You can actually drag and drop your fields around through the UI. So you could say, okay, for my article, I want the image on the left and the other fields on the right. And you could just drag those fields into this layout. And the sections part of it, a section is like a chunk of layout. So you could say, okay, at the top of this, I want 3 columns, and then underneath that, I want 2 columns. So each of those would be what's called a section, and then within the section, you place the content. And so this is useful for building out templates. That's not necessarily something that content editors can do. It's also available, you can activate it for a content type to be configurable per node. So you could say, for landing pages, I want the content editor to actually be able to use this for every single node of that content type. And so far the module doesn't have a lot of granularity around permissions, like what can the content editor actually place into the region. So it's really just a free-for-all at the moment, but that is something that's in the plan to address and make more configurable, so you can lock it down a bit more and say, okay, content editors can place this content into these kinds of layouts. And I think that's going to be a nice tool for those content editors who really want this flexibility. It's going to be a good selling point for them for selecting Drupal, because right now these tools are available in a lot of other systems. So if you look at something like WordPress, there's things like the Divi plugin that does this. Now, that being said, it doesn't do it on the level of Drupal, because with Drupal you're combining it with content types. So this is I think it's a much more sophisticated tool than those other ones that you might have seen in simpler content management systems. So.
Does it only allow blocks at the moment?
No, it's anything and everything. Yeah.
Just calls everything a block.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So good point. So there's this lingo that's a bit confusing. It actually uses the block to place things into sections. They're technically blocks, but they aren't things that we think of as blocks. So it's like, do you want to place a field? Do you want to place the node ID? Do you want to place the content type name? Just like panels, kind of a free-for-all of all the things available for the node. But that's part of the UI that's being worked on and that you can contribute to. So if you want to make the interface, I'm only showing you a tiny part of the interface, but if you have ideas and you want to make it improved, there's the Slack channel for layout where there's some issues. Okay, so testing. So you do all this work building and you're like, yeah, I think we have it ready, we have our tool, and we think we checked all the check boxes. Content editors are going to be happy. It's still really important to do some testing, which can just be really doing a training and watching somebody edit the site. That can be your testing. It doesn't have to be anything fancier than that. And the important thing in the training and the testing is that you don't do what I'm doing here. What am I doing here? I'm actually editing the site and the person's watching, right? That's not training. That's not testing. You should be letting the person who's going to be actually editing the site do their job. You can show them how to do it, but you should watch them and then take notes and see, okay, actually she didn't know how to do this, or this field should have been in the other way, or we're missing a setting here, we're missing a minimum image size. Take notes of the things that you missed. You're for sure going to find some things to improve, and then hopefully you have time left in your project to actually fix those things. Okay, so thinking forward, so there's, I mentioned earlier in my other talk about like work being done to improve the admin UI for Drupal. So there's some things that I mentioned today, things like uploading images or improving the previewing interface. That like these ideas are being proposed on Drupal.org in different initiatives, and I mean the admin UI initiative is the big one. And so this is something that we can take inspiration from, and hopefully we'll end up with some of these things in Drupal. Some of them maybe in the contrib space, and some of them more in Drupal core. So very exciting. And are any of you actually content editors? Yeah, okay, so you should do my UX study survey. I have like a short survey. You can be the first one to actually do it. This is the short link. bit.ly/Drupal UX MTL.
It's not up there right now.
It's not up here?
Like your other screen.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. No, it's probably too tiny for you to see anyway, but I have this survey, so in any case,
I'll stop by the booth.
stop by the booth. And for the rest of you, I will also eventually have a link to like an online survey that's meant to be used to just be distributed widely after the camp. So if you want to tweet that out, we're trying to get people's feedback. And the eventual idea is to compare Drupal actually to other platforms, to have some user testing around that, so we can see like how Drupal compares what people find easier about other platforms, and to feed that back into the work being done already in the initiatives. So that's the whole presentation. Thank you, guys.